In the summer of 2000, a young woman named Emily Carter packed up her small hatchback and began a road trip she had been planning for months. She was 22, freshly graduated from college, and like so many at that age, restless. Friends remembered her talking about wanting to see the country before stepping into what she called the real world. She wasn't reckless. People who knew her well often said she was adventurous but cautious, someone who double-checked directions, who called home to let her parents know where she was. Her plan was simple: drive west, stop at national parks along the way, take photographs, and write in the journal she always carried. She promised her parents she'd check in regularly, and during the first few days she did exactly that. The first calls were cheerful, filled with excitement about the open road. Her mother recalled Emily describing a campsite she had stayed at in Colorado, how she had watched the stars late into the night. She mailed a postcard from a small town near the Rockies, her handwriting neat, her words filled with energy and optimism. In those early days, it felt like everything was going exactly as planned. Emily's friends were supportive, but some admitted later that they worried about her traveling alone. A young woman on back highways, stopping at remote campsites and gas stations, carried risks. Yet Emily reassured them she had mapped everything carefully and kept pepper spray in her bag. She wasn't naive. She knew the dangers and promised she would be cautious. As she moved further west, she grew more fascinated with the desert landscapes she had only read about before. She told her brother during one call that the silence of the desert felt both beautiful and unsettling, like being very far from everything. That was part of the appeal: remoteness, solitude, space to think before life moved forward. The last conversations her family remembered were routine. Her father said she sounded tired but happy, describing long hours of driving and a plan to reach a national park by the end of the week. She mentioned needing to fuel up at the next stop and grabbing bottled water, the kind of small, ordinary detail that reassured them she was looking after herself. Nothing in her voice suggested worry or fear. But then the calls stopped. At first, her parents thought she had simply driven into an area with bad reception, the kind of spot where cell service dropped out. They waited, expecting to hear from her later that evening. When the night passed in silence, her mother began to call her phone repeatedly, each attempt going straight to voicemail. By the second day, unease had turned into fear. Her friends said later that something about Emily made it hard to believe she would vanish without a trace. She was steady, dependable, the sort who never missed a promised check-in. Even when she was away at school, she kept in close touch. For her parents, the silence was unthinkable. They tried to convince themselves there was an explanation: a broken phone, a dead battery. But the longer the hours stretched, the harder it was to believe. Her father called the local authorities, giving them the rough route she had described. He tried to recall every detail from their last call: the direction she said she was heading, the road she planned to take. Investigators would later note that the timeline of those calls would become the most critical piece in piecing together what happened next. By the third day without contact, fear overtook hope. Her parents reported her missing formally, and a case file was opened. What began as a family's growing worry was about to turn into something much larger: a search stretching across hundreds of miles of desert highways and isolated roads, where one wrong turn could change everything. And while Emily's road trip had started with excitement, the unanswered question of where she went would soon pull in investigators, search teams, and strangers who would never forget her name. Because within days, that silence would harden into something far darker. Her car discovered on a lonely desert track, her belongings still inside, and Emily nowhere to be found. In the days after Emily's disappearance was reported, investigators began the painstaking process of retracing her movements. Credit card records, phone logs, and interviews with anyone who might have seen her became the starting point. It didn't take long for them to establish her last verified stop. Somewhere between the national park she had visited and the next stretch of highway, she pulled into a small, nearly forgotten desert gas station. It was the kind of place travelers used out of necessity, not choice. Dust-coated pumps, a single convenience store, and miles of nothing in every direction. The clerk on duty that afternoon told investigators he remembered her clearly. A young woman traveling alone wasn't common out there. She had bought fuel, bottled water, and a snack, paying in cash. What stuck with him most, however, was her question. She had asked for directions to a highway shortcut, a road that bypassed a busier route and cut through open desert. He had told her about the turnoff, warning that it was rarely traveled and poorly maintained, but she didn't seem alarmed. Witnesses later recalled seeing her vehicle head in that direction not long after she left the station. That was the last time anyone could say for certain they saw her alive. Investigators returned to the gas station more than once, scrutinizing every detail. They asked about other customers that day, about vehicles parked near the pumps, about whether anyone had followed her when she pulled out. The clerk remembered a pair of truckers stopping later that evening, but didn't recall them interacting with her. Security cameras weren't in place. In 2000, small stations like that often operated without surveillance. No video existed to confirm who else might have been there at the same time. Detectives canvassed the area, speaking with ranchers and travelers who used the road. Some recalled a light-colored car heading west around that time, possibly hers, but none could say with certainty. A couple who had been driving through the region told police they thought they had seen a car pulled off the side of the desert highway, but they couldn't describe the driver. In missing person cases, these fragments of witness accounts are often all that investigators have to work with, and in Emily's case, each account was too vague to draw firm conclusions. The shortcut she asked about became the focus. Maps showed it as a long, desolate track cutting across uneven desert terrain before rejoining the main highway miles later. Locals avoided it, especially in summer, when heat warped the road and sudden storms could turn dirt stretches into impassable mud. For detectives, the road represented both opportunity and risk. If she had taken it, she might have saved time. But if something went wrong out there, she would have been isolated, with no help in sight. Her family found it difficult to hear the details. They imagined her pulling into that station, still optimistic about her trip, unaware she was about to drive into a place where no one would see her again. Her mother said later that it haunted her, the image of her daughter standing at that counter, asking for directions, trusting a stranger's word about a road she had never seen. Detectives searched the shortcut thoroughly. They followed its bends and narrow lanes, looking for signs of a breakdown or an accident. Tire impressions in the sand were photographed, though wind and shifting ground quickly erased anything older than a few days. Aerial sweeps were ordered, helicopters flying low to check for any sign of her vehicle. But nothing surfaced in those first days. For investigators, the gas station remained a fixed point in the timeline. Everything before it could be accounted for through phone calls and transactions. Everything after it dissolved into speculation. They returned to the clerk again and again, asking the same questions, hoping something new would surface. Each time his account stayed consistent. She had been polite, composed, not in a rush. She seemed like any other traveler passing through. But she was different, because she never came back. Theories began to take shape. Some believed she had taken the shortcut, gotten stuck, and tried to walk for help. Others feared she might have encountered someone with darker intentions on that empty road. The fact that no one else had reported seeing her created a vacuum where only guesses could live. For her parents, the silence of those days was unbearable. They knew her habits, knew she would have called if she was stranded or lost. Every hour without news deepened their dread. And while investigators built their timeline, her family clung to hope that she might still be found nearby, dehydrated or disoriented, but alive. That hope would soon collide with a darker discovery. Because only days after confirming the gas station sighting, investigators stumbled across something in the desert that shifted the entire search, and it brought them closer to understanding where Emily's journey ended. By the end of the first week, search efforts had expanded beyond the gas station timeline. Deputies, volunteers, and state investigators fanned out along the shortcut road, scanning the dirt track for anything that might indicate where Emily had gone. The desert was vast and unforgiving, with stretches of jagged canyon walls, washes carved by flash floods, and miles of sand that shifted with the wind. Each day that passed made it harder to believe she was still close, yet investigators knew that in disappearances like this, vehicles often provided the first real break. That break came on the 6th day. A sheriff's deputy spotted a vehicle partially obscured by a rise in the desert terrain. It matched the description of Emily's hatchback. As the search team approached, they noted the unusual state of the car. The driver's side door was ajar, swinging slightly with the wind. The keys were still in the ignition. To investigators, that detail immediately suggested she had not planned to be away from the car for long. The vehicle itself was stuck in a patch of soft sand, its back tires partially sunken. Tire tracks indicated that she had tried to reverse out more than once, leaving deep grooves before finally giving up. The trunk was closed, and inside were camping supplies, her sleeping bag, and a bag of groceries. Nothing appeared stolen or rifled through. On the passenger seat sat her water bottle, half empty, along with a folded paper map. The engine was off, but the fuel gauge showed she had more than enough gas to continue her trip had she been able to free the car. For investigators, the scene raised immediate questions. If she had been stranded, why hadn't she stayed with the vehicle? Survival experts later pointed out that in desert environments, the safest option is almost always to remain with a car where shade, supplies, and visibility for search aircraft are greater. Yet Emily appeared to have left, and there was no obvious sign of why. Search teams spread outward from the vehicle, looking for any indication of her path. Normally, footprints in sand might provide clues, but here they found almost nothing. The ground surrounding the car had been disturbed by searchers, by wind, and possibly by animals. Any faint impressions that might have belonged to her had already been erased. One investigator remarked that it was as though she had vanished into thin air the moment she stepped out. Cadaver dogs were brought in, circling the site repeatedly, but they did not indicate strongly in any particular direction. Helicopters swept the desert during the day, while ground teams pushed into canyons and washes nearby. The hope was that she might have walked towards shelter or a water source, but as hours stretched into days, the lack of footprints or personal belongings discarded along the way became deeply troubling. Her family arrived at the scene under escort, standing beside the abandoned hatchback. For her mother, the image of the open door and the keys left behind was unbearable. She later described it as feeling like her daughter had stepped away only moments before, as though she might return at any second, but the silence pressed in and made clear she would not. Investigators treated the car as a potential crime scene. Photographs were taken, fibers collected, and prints lifted. Yet aside from Emily's own belongings, no clear forensic evidence pointed to another person's involvement. There were no signs of a struggle inside or around the vehicle. The doors were unlocked, and valuables remained untouched. To the sheriff's department, the possibilities narrowed to two. Either she left the car voluntarily to seek help and succumbed to the environment, or someone encountered her on that isolated track and took her. Searches extended 5, then 10 miles in every direction. Volunteers described the heat as nearly unbearable, with ground temperatures exceeding 120 degrees. Several members of the search collapsed from exhaustion, underscoring how quickly someone could perish if they had set out on foot without enough water. Yet, despite the dangers, not a single trace of Emily was found. No clothing, no dropped items, no remains. The car became the vanishing point. It was the last physical connection investigators had to her. Everything beyond that was speculation. Some deputies leaned toward the theory she had tried to walk out and been overcome by the desert. Others suspected foul play, believing the absence of footprints might indicate another vehicle had picked her up. The family, desperate for answers, clung to the hope that she had been taken alive, perhaps against her will, but still somewhere out there. For days, the hatchback sat on that dirt track, a silent marker of where her journey had stopped. Reporters photographed it, and locals drove out to see for themselves the place where a young woman had vanished. Each person who stood there felt the same unsettling weight, the idea that someone could disappear so completely, leaving behind a car with the keys still inside, but nothing else. As the official search wound down after weeks without progress, investigators knew the car would be towed and logged into evidence storage. But long after it was removed, the memory of its open door and the empty desert surrounding it lingered. That haunting image would come to define the case, because if the desert had taken her, it had taken every trace, leaving only questions in its place. And for her family, the sight of the car raised a devastating truth. The daughter they loved had been there, standing on that dirt track. Within moments, she was gone, swallowed by silence. What they didn't yet know was that this vanishing point would mark not just the end of her road trip, but the beginning of a mystery that would stretch on for decades. Within hours of discovering Emily's abandoned vehicle, authorities escalated their efforts. What had begun as a missing persons case now became one of the largest coordinated desert searches in the region's history. Law enforcement brought in additional deputies from neighboring counties, state agencies lent aircraft, and local volunteer groups organized shifts to cover as much ground as possible. The sheriff at the time described it as a race against the environment itself. In the desert, every hour without water could be the difference between life and death. Helicopters swept across the landscape at low altitude, their crews scanning for the faintest sign of movement or distress. From above, they looked for shapes in the sand, clothing colors against the pale earth, or even the glint of metal from a dropped object. On the ground, cadaver dogs were deployed around the vehicle and into washes that cut across the desert floor. The dogs worked in tight formations, handlers pushing them to fan out as far as possible, but the results were inconclusive. The wind scattered scent, and the punishing heat slowed both animals and handlers. Volunteers poured in from nearby towns, some of them strangers who had never met Emily but felt compelled to help. They carried gallon jugs of water and walked in long, gridded lines across the desert floor. Some collapsed from exhaustion themselves, carried back to base camps by medical teams who were as busy treating searchers as they were waiting for news of the missing woman. The ground was unforgiving, littered with sharp rocks and cactus, and the heat index often rose above 110 degrees. Even the most experienced search and rescue workers admitted the conditions were among the worst they had ever faced. Despite the manpower and resources, each day ended the same way, empty-handed. No footprints, no clothing, no water bottles, no personal items that could have marked Emily's path. The desert seemed to resist giving up any trace of her. For her family, watching the search unfold was unbearable. They stood by the command posts, waiting for updates, clinging to any shred of hope. Each time a helicopter landed or a dog team returned, they braced for news. Each time, the answer was silence. Investigators tried to impose structure on the chaos. They created maps of search zones, marked areas already covered, and directed teams to focus on canyons, dry riverbeds, and ridgelines where shade might have offered temporary relief. Experts pointed out that people in survival situations often make decisions that don't follow logic, walking uphill in search of a vantage point or toward a mirage that seems like water. Theories circulated among the search teams. Some believed she had succumbed to dehydration and heat stroke within hours of leaving her car, her body concealed by the terrain. Others suspected foul play, that someone had intercepted her before she ever had the chance to walk far. Detectives faced pressure from both the family and the public. News crews began to cover the story, showing images of exhausted volunteers and lines of vehicles parked at the desert edge. Locals whispered about dangers on those roads, lone travelers picked up by strangers, truckers passing through, or worse. The absence of any physical evidence left investigators juggling possibilities with no way to eliminate them. One persistent theory suggested Emily may have left the vehicle intentionally, not just to seek help, but to disappear. Detectives explored her personal history, searching for signs she might have wanted to walk away from her life. They interviewed friends, combed through her journal entries, and checked her bank records. Nothing pointed to her planning an escape. She had graduation plans, future job prospects, and no indication of despair. Her family pushed back against the idea, calling it a desperate attempt to fill a void where answers should be. As the search stretched into its second and third weeks, morale sank. Volunteers began to taper off, replaced only by smaller, specialized teams. The sheriff's department acknowledged publicly what many already feared, that the chances of finding her alive were diminishing rapidly. Still, they kept going, combing areas miles from where her car had been found, hoping that distance would reveal something the immediate perimeter had not. At night, the desert cooled, and the camps fell into uneasy silence. Family members clutched at the hope that perhaps she had found shelter, that she was waiting, too weak to move but still alive somewhere. The next day always destroyed that hope. Nothing appeared. No fresh leads emerged. By the end of the month, the official search was scaled back. Helicopters were grounded, volunteer lines disbanded, and resources redirected to other cases. For her parents, the announcement felt like a death sentence. They had watched strangers risk their own health for weeks, only to see the desert return everything back to emptiness. One official said quietly what no one wanted to hear, that sometimes the desert simply keeps its secrets. But for investigators, pulling back didn't mean closing the case. It meant shifting focus. If Emily had not been found by search teams, then perhaps her disappearance was not just a tragic accident. Theories of foul play began to move to the front. And as the desert hunt ended in silence, attention turned to the people who had crossed paths with her in those final days. When the desert search yielded nothing, detectives shifted their focus from the terrain to the people who had known Emily, or might have crossed paths with her before she vanished. If the desert wasn't holding the answer, then perhaps someone else was. They began the slow, methodical work of pulling apart her personal life, interviewing friends, colleagues, and family, searching for tension or conflict that might have spilled over into something darker. The first person who drew their attention was her former boyfriend. The relationship had ended months before, but it hadn't ended cleanly. Friends described him as volatile, someone who struggled with jealousy and had difficulty letting go. Investigators questioned him directly, pressing for an alibi during the week Emily went missing. He insisted he had been at work and later at home, and time cards seemed to support that. Still, detectives remained wary. They combed through his phone records, searching for calls or messages to Emily that might suggest he had followed her or tried to contact her on the road. Nothing incriminating surfaced, without evidence placing him anywhere near the desert. He remained only a shadow in the file, a person of interest who couldn't be ruled out, but couldn't be tied to her disappearance either. Another lead emerged from accounts of a fellow traveler. Multiple witnesses in the small desert town near the gas station remembered a man in his 20s, also passing through, who had spoken briefly about heading west the same day Emily stopped there. Detectives tracked him down weeks later. He admitted he'd been on the same route, but denied ever meeting her. His description of the road matched what they already knew, and he provided bus tickets that showed he left the region soon after. Still, suspicions lingered. If Emily had trusted a stranger for directions or companionship, could he have been that person? Without surveillance footage or direct evidence, detectives could do little more than file his statement and move on. The most troubling lead, however, came later, when federal authorities alerted the sheriff's department to a long-haul truck driver arrested on unrelated charges. His routes often took him through the same highways Emily had traveled, and his criminal record was violent. He was known for picking up hitchhikers, some of whom later reported feeling unsafe in his presence. Detectives examined whether he had been near the region in July of 2000, and records suggested he could have been. They interviewed him in prison, but he denied any knowledge of Emily. No physical evidence ever tied him to her disappearance. Yet the overlap in timing and geography was enough to plant a seed of doubt that has never fully faded. Rumors spread quickly in the community. Some locals whispered that the former boyfriend had driven out secretly, his anger boiling over. Others believed the truck driver theory, convinced he had more victims than anyone knew. Online forums years later would debate the fellow traveler, arguing that he had lied about never seeing her. Each theory had supporters, but none had the evidence to lift it out of speculation. For the family, the swirl of names and possibilities brought no comfort. Each suspect profile felt like a trap. On one hand, they wanted someone to blame, someone who could be held accountable. On the other, without proof, each possibility only deepened their torment. Their daughter was missing, and every potential explanation dissolved into another dead end. Detectives tried to keep the investigation grounded. They re-examined physical evidence from the car, hoping for fingerprints or fibers that might link to one of the suspects. Nothing new surfaced. They expanded interviews, asking locals if they remembered vehicles parked near the station that day or unusual activity on the road. Witness accounts conflicted, blurring into one another until timelines became unreliable. What the investigation did uncover was the fragility of memory and the limits of procedure. Everyone remembered something slightly different. The gas station clerk thought she had been alone. A rancher believed he saw a second car trailing hers, but later admitted he couldn't be sure of the date. Hikers recalled hearing a woman's voice echoing across the desert, though no evidence confirmed it. Piece by piece, the case fractured into competing stories, none strong enough to build on. Theories multiplied. Some insisted Emily had fallen victim to a predator. Others believed she had miscalculated, left the car, and perished in the heat, her body hidden in terrain too vast to ever yield her remains. And in every conversation, in every rumor, was the question that drove investigators forward. Had someone followed her, or had the desert alone claimed her? The uncertainty divided the community. Neighbors speculated about who could be trusted, who might be hiding something. For her family, the whispers were unbearable. They had to live with the knowledge that while their daughter's case was unsolved, every conversation, every rumor, seemed to cast suspicion without resolution. By the end of that year, detectives had exhausted their strongest leads. None of the three men could be tied directly to Emily's disappearance. None of the theories could be proven. The case began to lose momentum, swallowed by silence. And as the suspects faded back into their lives, watched, but not charged, the family was left with an even more devastating realization. If no one could be linked to her vanishing, then perhaps she had been lost to the desert itself, leaving no one to hold accountable and nothing to bring home. In the months after the desert search wound down, the case began to lose its urgency in the eyes of law enforcement. New crimes demanded attention, resources shifted elsewhere, and Emily's disappearance settled into that limbo where hope still lingered, but answers never came. For her family, however, the fight was only beginning. They printed hundreds of flyers with her face on them, plastering them on store windows, highway rest stops, and community bulletin boards. Every time one was torn down by weather or neglect, they put up another. Her parents organized candlelight vigils on anniversaries, gatherings where neighbors stood in silence, holding photos of the young woman whose absence grew heavier with each passing year. Detectives kept the file open, but admitted privately that leads were nearly non-existent. With no physical evidence, no eyewitnesses beyond vague recollections, and no confirmed suspects, the investigation grew stagnant. The family pressed for the case to be reopened formally, writing letters, calling state officials, begging for renewed attention. They pointed out other disappearances in the region, hikers who had vanished, motorists who had been reported missing under eerily similar circumstances. The sheriff's office acknowledged the pattern but stopped short of declaring any connection. Without proof, the disappearances remained isolated tragedies, never officially linked. As time stretched from months into years, the weight of silence settled in. The family's home became a place both frozen and restless. Emily's room was left untouched, as if waiting for her to return, but the family's daily lives became consumed by the search. Her mother kept binders of articles and notes, phone numbers of journalists and investigators, clippings of any case that resembled their own. Her father drove the desert roads again and again, staring at the barren stretches where she had last been seen, convinced he might find something the professionals had missed. The community grew divided. Some sympathized deeply, supporting the family's relentless pursuit. Others began to distance themselves, whispering that the case had no answers, that clinging to hope had become an obsession. Rumors about foul play and theories about the desert's dangers continued to circulate, but with no resolution, fatigue set in. People moved on. Only the family remained locked in the same endless cycle of grief and unanswered questions. The case file, once thick with daily notes and reports, was eventually moved into storage, stacked alongside dozens of other unsolved disappearances from the region. Investigators who had once walked the desert in the blistering sun were reassigned, and new deputies joined the department with little more than a passing awareness of Emily's name. Officially, the case was not closed, but in practice, it was no longer active. Then came the internet. By the late 2000s, Emily's story found new life in online forums dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Strangers dissected every known detail, poring over maps of the desert, analyzing timelines, and speculating about what might have happened. Some argued she had fallen victim to a serial predator, pointing to other missing women in nearby counties. Others insisted it had been a tragic accident, her body simply hidden in terrain too vast to ever be recovered. A few suggested darker conspiracies, hinting at cover-ups or patterns law enforcement had ignored. Her family watched these discussions with mixed emotions. On one hand, it brought renewed attention to her case, kept her name from fading. On the other, it reduced her life to theories and speculation, strangers debating her fate as though it were a puzzle rather than a human tragedy. Armchair detectives sent messages to her parents with theories, some compassionate, others cruel. Every claim of a new lead raised hope briefly, only to collapse under scrutiny. The years blurred together. Each anniversary of her disappearance was marked by renewed grief, another vigil, another plea for information. But with no body, no confirmed evidence, and no confessions, the case remained frozen. The desert had taken her, and it had kept its silence. Yet the silence did not erase her memory. Her face continued to appear in missing persons databases, her name in articles about cold cases. And while officials could only admit that the trail had gone cold, those closest to her believed the story was not finished. They believed that somewhere, buried in sand or in secrets, a piece of the truth still waited to be uncovered. It would take more than 2 decades before the desert finally offered up even a fragment of what it had concealed. 20 years passed, and Emily's disappearance became less a current investigation than a story the desert carried in whispers. Locals began referring to the lonely stretch of road near where her car had been found as the vanishing stretch. Travelers passing through spoke of it with unease, pointing out that she had not been the only one to disappear in the region. The reputation of that road grew darker with time, until it became a kind of warning told to those unfamiliar with the terrain. Don't stop, don't travel alone, and don't trust the silence. Hikers and campers occasionally came across remains in the desert, sun-bleached bones, weathered shoes, scraps of clothing. But when investigators tested them, none matched Emily's DNA. Each report reignited the family's hope, only to leave them crushed again when the results returned negative. They had come to live in the space between possibility and reality, where every phone call from authorities could carry devastating news or nothing at all. Her mother grew older, with a quiet grief that never left her. She admitted to friends that she no longer expected to bring her daughter home alive, but still wanted something tangible, anything that would allow her to lay her child to rest. Her father remained restless, driving the same desert routes even 2 decades later, convinced that persistence might one day reveal what the official searches had missed. For him, the desert was not just where Emily disappeared, it was where time itself had stopped. The broader community had changed. New families moved in, new businesses opened, but Emily's story lingered like an echo. Some who lived near the vanishing stretch left roadside crosses and flowers, anonymous markers that blended with others dedicated to different names and different years. Each one represented a life lost to the desert, each one fueling the unease that something was wrong in that landscape. Rumors of serial predators, hidden graves, or cursed ground blended into local folklore. Online, her case found a second life. Cold case forms and amateur investigators kept her name alive, comparing her disappearance to others in the Southwest. Maps were posted with pins marking vanishings along highways, debates unfolding over whether a single offender had been responsible, or whether the desert itself simply devoured those who underestimated it. Emily's story became part of a broader narrative, a cautionary tale cited in discussions about traveling alone and the dangers of remote landscapes. Yet, the theories never moved beyond speculation. No one could prove anything, and the silence of the desert only deepened. For the family, hope became a complicated thing. They still organized memorial gatherings on anniversaries, though fewer people attended as years went by. They still kept her face on missing persons lists, still gave interviews when reporters circled back around to cover old cases. But privately, they admitted to themselves that she might never be found. Acceptance came not as peace, but as exhaustion. They had lived 2 decades in the shadow of a question with no answer, and the weight of it had changed them. The desert itself seemed indifferent. Storms swept across it, erasing tracks and shifting the ground. The sun baked away traces of life, while winds scattered what little might have remained. Investigators who had once been consumed by the case retired or moved on. Files were archived, boxes stored on shelves, the paper inside slowly fading. Emily became another name among many, another face in the quiet gallery of the missing. And yet, the silence never erased her entirely. Every time a hiker stumbled on something in the sand, every time a shoe or a bone was sent to a lab, her name returned. It was as if the desert refused to let go completely, offering hints without answers, fragments without resolution. For her family, each of those moments tore open old wounds, reminding them that she was both gone and still present, both lost and waiting. 2 decades after her disappearance, the family no longer spoke about closure. They spoke about endurance. They had lived with the unknown for so long that it had become its own form of existence. But the mystery never stopped pulling at them, never stopped haunting those who remembered her. Because the desert was not empty. It was filled with secrets, secrets buried under shifting sands, secrets that had kept her from them for more than 20 years. And in 2023, those secrets would finally begin to stir. In the summer of 2023, more than 2 decades after Emily Carter's disappearance, the desert that had held its silence was disturbed, not by investigators or search teams, but by heavy machinery. A development project had been approved to expand utilities near an old service road miles from the vanishing stretch where her vehicle had been found. Bulldozers and excavators clawed at the hardened ground, pulling up layers of soil that had not been touched in years. For the workers, it was routine, another job under the punishing sun. But one afternoon, as the machines tore into a ridge of compacted sand and stone, something unexpected emerged. A backhoe operator noticed rusted metal fragments scattered in the dirt. At first he assumed they were scraps of abandoned machinery, the kind often left behind in remote areas. But nearby, buried deeper, the blade struck something softer. The machine scraped fabric, and when workers dug by hand, they found a bundle partially exposed. It appeared to be cloth wrapped tightly around an object, weathered but still intact. The discovery was strange enough that the foreman halted work and called authorities. By evening, deputies from the county sheriff's office had arrived, cordoning off the site with tape. The bundle was carefully lifted from the soil, placed in evidence bags, and transported to a temporary command tent. Forensic technicians in gloves and masks unwrapped the layers, revealing what appeared to be a backpack, faded but unmistakable. The canvas was stiff, its seams frayed, but inside were items that seemed untouched by time. As the team laid them out one by one, silence spread among the officials standing nearby. There were notebooks, a wallet, and smaller personal belongings that could not be mistaken for anyone else's. The sheriff's office quickly confirmed what the family had prayed for and dreaded in equal measure. The backpack belonged to Emily. Her driver's license was inside, the photograph slightly water-damaged but still visible. Alongside it was a disposable camera, its casing cracked but film still inside. A folded paper map, edges torn and marked with ink, was tucked into one of the smaller compartments. Each artifact carried the weight of years, frozen in time since the summer of 2000. Forensic experts moved quickly to preserve the contents. The film was sent to a specialized lab capable of handling aged, fragile negatives. The map was photographed and analyzed, its ink markings traced to identify the routes she had planned or possibly traveled. The backpack itself was examined for prints or DNA that might indicate another person's involvement. It was painstaking work, each step measured because after 23 years, even the smallest detail could matter. The location of the find raised immediate questions. The service road where the excavation took place was within a few miles of the shortcut Emily had been directed toward in her last known interaction at the gas station. Yet the area had not been part of the original search grid in 2000. Investigators speculated that shifting sands and occasional flash floods might have buried the pack deeper over time, concealing it from aerial searches and ground teams. Others wondered whether it had been deliberately placed there, hidden beneath soil and rock to ensure it would never be found. When news of the discovery broke, Emily's family was contacted first. For them, the phone call was both a relief and a devastation. After years of vigils and unanswered questions, there was finally something tangible, a piece of her life recovered from the desert. But it also confirmed a truth they had fought to avoid. Emily had not simply walked away from her life. Something had stopped her journey, and this backpack was the first fragment of the answer. The community reacted quickly. Old rumors reignited, speculation returned to the forefront, and online forums dissected every report. Some insisted the discovery supported the theory of foul play, that someone had taken her belongings and hidden them. Others believed she had become disoriented, dropped the pack while trying to find her way out, and the desert had simply swallowed it. Investigators themselves did not rush to conclusions. They knew that while the backpack was a breakthrough, it was not a resolution. It was evidence, not explanation. The sheriff's office called in outside forensic anthropologists and geologists to analyze the site. They examined soil layers to estimate how long the pack had been buried and whether its placement suggested natural burial or deliberate concealment. Results were inconclusive. Nature and human intent could look strikingly similar after 23 years. But what mattered most was the personal connection. Inside the pack were journal pages, faded but legible in parts, her handwriting still clear. Some described ordinary travel notes, temperatures, distances, impressions of small towns. Others hinted at fatigue, long hours of driving, and a sense of isolation. The last entry stopped abruptly, mid-sentence, as though interrupted. That fragment of writing only deepened the mystery, raising the possibility that she had been cut off suddenly, perhaps by someone else's presence. The discovery electrified the case. Detectives reopened the file, calling in retired officers who had once worked it. They compared notes, refreshed memories, and looked for overlooked connections. The desert had given them something real, but it was also a reminder of everything that remained missing. There were no remains, no confirmed timeline beyond the gas station and the car, and now a backpack unearthed 2 decades later that posed as many questions as it answered. For Emily's family, the objects were returned only after meticulous analysis. They held her belongings in silence, tracing their fingers over the straps, the ink, the pages, as if holding onto a piece of her frozen in time. It was both a comfort and a wound, because while it brought her closer, it reminded them how far away she still was. And yet, inside that backpack was something investigators knew could change everything. A roll of undeveloped film, 23 years old, carrying images of her final days, and maybe of the last person who ever saw her alive. The backpack's contents were transported to a forensic lab where every item was cataloged and preserved. Among the belongings, 3 stood out: a torn paper map with pen markings, her driver's license still pressed flat in the wallet, and a disposable camera, the kind common in 2000, but now a fragile artifact of another time. Investigators knew that each piece could hold answers, or at least fragments of them. But it was the camera, with its roll of undeveloped film, that stirred the greatest sense of possibility. The film had survived 2 decades buried in the desert, its casing cracked, but the negatives inside intact enough to attempt recovery. Specialists placed it in a controlled environment, careful not to expose it prematurely to light. After days of preparation, the film was developed frame by frame. What emerged first were ordinary snapshots. Emily's familiar handwriting labeling the dates on the film, wide shots of desert highways, and images of rock formations under the harsh midday sun. She had taken photos of her campsite, her car parked against barren landscapes, and the distant horizon stretching endlessly behind her. To her family, these images were proof of her presence, frozen moments of her journey preserved against the silence that had followed. The sequence of photos traced a kind of path. Early frames showed familiar landmarks near where her vehicle had been found. Others depicted trails weaving through canyons and washes, suggesting she had explored the area before something went wrong. Investigators studied each image, noting details of the terrain, trying to align them with maps. They hoped the camera would reveal her final movements, a breadcrumb trail left unintentionally. But it was the final frames that drew the most attention. Some of the negatives were damaged, the edges warped by time and exposure. In several, light leaks washed out the images almost entirely. Yet one photo survived well enough to ignite debate. At first glance, it appeared to be another landscape shot, the same rugged terrain that filled the earlier frames. But in the distance, near the edge of the horizon, a shape stood against the light. Zoomed in, the shape resembled a figure, upright, human, partially obscured by blur. To investigators, the image was haunting. Was it another traveler caught in her frame by chance? Was it someone she had encountered in the desert, or was it a trick of distance, a rock formation misinterpreted as human? Forensic photo analysts attempted to clarify the image, enhancing contrast, but the limitations of the disposable camera and decades-old negatives meant the figure remained ambiguous. Theories multiplied instantly. Some believed the photo showed a stranger who had crossed paths with her, possibly the person responsible for her disappearance. Others thought she had been traveling with someone she never mentioned, a companion hidden from her family's knowledge. Skeptics argued it was nothing more than an illusion, a shadow of rock mistaken for a human form. Yet the placement of the figure, in the final images of the roll, taken just before she vanished, was impossible to ignore. The torn map added weight to the mystery. Lines in pen traced routes branching from the main highway, including the shortcut she had reportedly asked about at the gas station. Near one section, a small circle was drawn, but no notes indicated why. Investigators speculated that the circle might mark a destination she intended to reach, or perhaps an area she had already explored. Combined with the final photograph, it suggested she had not been wandering aimlessly. She had been documenting something, maybe someone. Her driver's license, found in the wallet inside the pack, served as the final confirmation. It was not a copy, not a stray item. It was hers. For her family, holding it again was crushing. It was both proof that she had been there and proof that she had not left on her own terms. If she had intended to disappear, why leave behind the very item needed to build a new life? To them, it was further evidence that something had interrupted her journey abruptly, stripping her of the chance to take even her most essential belongings. As news of the developed film spread, speculation surged. The photo of the distant figure circulated online, scrutinized by strangers who magnified it, filtered it, and argued over whether it showed a man, a woman, or no one at all. Some insisted they could see an arm or a head. Others swore it was a mirage. The ambiguity fueled obsession, but also deepened the family's torment. To them, the photo was not a curiosity. It was potentially the last moment of their daughter's life, captured unknowingly on film. Detectives knew the image alone could never solve the case. It was suggestive, not definitive. But in a file long defined by absence, it was a rare presence, a clue that Emily had not been entirely alone in those final hours. Whether the figure was friend or stranger, it placed another possibility into a story that had been frozen for 23 years. The desert had given back a fragment of her life, but in doing so, it had raised even more questions. Who or what had stood in the distance when she lifted that camera? And why, after that frame, had everything gone silent? The discovery of Emily Carter's backpack in 2023 reignited a case that many had quietly assumed would never move forward again. Forensic analysts moved quickly to confirm what her driver's license and personal items already suggested. The belongings were undeniably hers. Yet the absence of human remains meant that the most crucial answer, the question of what had actually happened to her, remained just as elusive as it had been 23 years earlier. Detectives reopened the file with fresh urgency, bringing in specialists who had not been part of the original investigation. They sifted through the items again, subjecting the backpack, the fabric wrappings, and the fragments of soil to DNA testing. Nothing pointed to another individual, no foreign prints, no biological traces that could tie her disappearance to a suspect. The desert had preserved her belongings, but it had stripped them of the forensic evidence investigators hoped for. Attention turned to the photo, the single frame from the disposable camera that appeared to show a human figure in the distance. The debate over that image quickly split experts. Some photographic analysts argued it was a classic case of pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive patterns where none exist. To them, the shape was a rock formation, blurred by the camera's poor resolution and decades of film degradation. But others disagreed. They pointed out subtle contrasts in the outline, suggesting posture, shoulders, and what might have been a head turned toward the lens. If true, that meant Emily had not been alone when she took her final pictures. The photo became a point of national fascination. Media outlets revisited the case, placing her name back in headlines after years of silence, Online communities dissected every pixel, circulating enhanced versions of the image, debating whether it was proof of an encounter or a meaningless shadow. Some claimed to see a man, others a woman, while skeptics argued it could be nothing at all. The uncertainty only deepened the case's notoriety, transforming it from a forgotten cold file into a haunting puzzle once more. For her family, the discovery cut in two directions. On one hand, the backpack was validation, proof that their daughter had not simply vanished without trace, proof that she had been there, alive, documenting her journey. On the other hand, it reopened the wound of her absence. Her mother described holding the backpack with trembling hands, feeling as though she was standing at the edge of closure, but unable to step across. Without her daughter's body, there could be no funeral, no final goodbye. Investigators mapped the excavation site against the original search grids from 2000. They realized the area had fallen just outside the zones covered by search teams, a margin of error that haunted those who had been involved at the time. Could they have found it if they had extended the grid by only a mile or two? That question weighed heavily on retired deputies who remembered the desperate days of the original search. Theories resurfaced in the wake of the discovery. Some argued Emily had become disoriented, dropped her backpack while searching for help, and collapsed somewhere beyond reach, her remains still hidden in the vast desert. Others insisted the backpack's burial suggested deliberate concealment, that someone had hidden her belongings to erase evidence of a crime. Investigators could not rule out either possibility. The desert blurred distinctions between accident and foul play, erasing timelines and covering tracks with equal indifference. The family pressed once more for broader investigation, urging law enforcement to compare Emily's case with other disappearances in the region. Patterns were noted. Travelers lost on highways, hikers never recovered, missing women whose last locations clustered along desolate stretches of road. But official connections remained unproven. The desert had taken many, and whether Emily was part of a larger pattern or a singular tragedy could not be determined. The torn map inside the backpack was studied closely. Analysts highlighted the ink markings, debating whether the circle drawn on one section indicated a meeting point, a landmark, or simply a note to herself. But without her voice to explain, it remained another fragment without context. The map, like the photo, teased meaning without delivering answers. By the end of the year, the case had drawn the attention of documentary crews, podcasts, and amateur sleuths across the country. Yet for all the speculation, nothing concrete emerged. The excavation had given investigators something they had not had in 2 decades, a direct connection to Emily's last days. But it had not provided what the family most needed: resolution. The sheriff's office summarized the case with a blunt truth. The desert had given back a fragment, but not the whole story. Emily Carter's belongings had been found, but Emily herself remained missing. And so, 23 years after she set out on a journey across the country, her fate was still a question mark suspended in time. A reminder of how quickly a life can vanish into silence, and how sometimes, even when the earth finally stirs, it refuses to give back the entire truth.